If you are really losing passion, why does this version of you feel quieter instead of emptier? That is the part almost no one explains, because you were taught that when something leaves you, it feels obvious, it feels heavy, it feels final. But sometimes what disappears is not your drive. It is the constant inner urgency you learn to mistake for aliveness. And when that urgency starts fading, it can feel unfamiliar, almost blank. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something inside you may finally be calming down. What makes this so disorienting is that the change does not arrive as a dramatic loss. It arrives as a reduction in inner pressure. You still care. You still notice. You still want your life to mean something, but the way you feel that desire begins to shift. It no longer comes with the same sharpness and the same urgency, the same constant internal command to move, fix, anticipate, prepare. And because that older intensity once felt like proof that you were engaged with life, the absence of it can be misread almost immediately. This is where a lot of people turn against themselves too soon. They notice that their mind is not racing in the same way. They notice that certain things do not provoke the same level of reaction. They notice a little more space between a thought and a response, a little more distance between a feeling and a conclusion. And instead of recognizing that as a change in state, they label it as decline. They call it laziness. They call it disconnection. They call it a lack of passion. But what they are actually reacting to is unfamiliarity. Because when your system has been living in tension for a long time, or tension starts to feel normal. And that matters more than most people realize, because stress does not just affect the body in some abstract way. It can affect how you feel emotionally, how much energy you seem to have, and how you move through ordinary daily life. So when that stress has shaped your baseline for long enough, the intensity it creates can start to look like personality. It can start to feel like identity. You begin to think, this is just who I am. I am the one who is always alert, always scanning, always leaning forward internally, always bracing before anything even happens. So when that pattern starts loosening, you do not necessarily feel relieved at first. Sometimes you feel less defined. That is why this phase can feel strangely empty without actually being empty. The old signal is quieter, but the deeper self underneath it has not disappeared. It is simply not shouting in the same voice anymore. And because the mind is used to reading urgency as importance, the quieter state can feel less meaningful at first, less alive, less certain. Not because your inner world has become weaker, but because it is no longer being amplified by the same level of internal alarm. This is also why people often say they feel off, but cannot explain why. It is not chaos exactly. It is not clarity yet either. It is something in between, a softer internal climate, a different rhythm. You are not pushing yourself with the same force, and that can be unsettling if force was the language you learned to trust. You may even miss the friction, not because it was good for you, but because it was familiar. And familiarity has a powerful way of disguising itself as truth. So the mistake is not simply assuming that intense means passionate. The deeper mistake is assuming that calm means empty. Because those are not the same thing. A state of constant activation can create the illusion of purpose simply because it is loud. It gives you a feeling of movement, even when that movement is mostly internal pressure. And when that pressure begins to reduce, your first interpretation may be that something valuable is disappearing. But what if the opposite is happening? What if what is fading is not your depth, but the condition that made everything feel urgent all the time? Then the quieter mind is not evidence that you care less. The softer reaction is not evidence that you are broken. The reduced urgency is not evidence that life has lost meaning. It may simply mean your system is no longer sounding the same alarm every moment of the day. And this is where most people misread their own body. They assume the absence of strain is the absence of self, when sometimes it is the first sign that the self is no longer being drowned out by survival patterns. So no, not everything that softens is disappearing. Some things soften because they are stabilizing. Some things become less intense because they no longer need to scream. And when you understand that, the experience starts to look very different. It is not a loss of passion. It is the unfamiliar feeling of no longer needing to be on guard in order to feel alive inside your mind. This is why the quieter version of you can feel so unsettling at first. Not because it is wrong, not because something essential is missing, but because you have spent so long measuring yourself through intensity that anything softer begins to look unfamiliar. And when something feels unfamiliar inside your own mind, the first interpretation is rarely peace. It is usually fear, because most people do not realize how much of their self-image was built around pressure, around urgency, around the constant feeling that something had to be solved, anticipated, managed, or held together internally. That pressure starts to become more than a state. It becomes a mirror. You look at how activated you are, how quickly you think, how strongly you react, and you assume that must mean you are engaged, alive, moving, still becoming someone. So when that inner force starts to lower, the mind does not immediately call it regulation. It calls it loss. And this is where the misunderstanding deepens, because the old logic feels convincing. If I am not being pushed from within, then I must be slowing down. If I am not reacting with the same force, then I must care less. If I am not mentally gripping everything as tightly, then maybe I am becoming passive, maybe disconnected, maybe less myself. But that conclusion is built on one hidden assumption: that intensity is the same as truth, that pressure is the same as purpose. And that is not always true. Stress can affect how you feel, how much energy you have, and how you move through daily life. So if stress has been shaping your internal state for a long time, it can begin to feel normal even when it is exhausting. It can start to feel familiar even when it is narrowing your experience. And once something becomes familiar, that the body and mind often stop questioning it. They organize around it. They adapt to it. They start reading it as baseline. This is why a quieter internal state can feel almost unnatural in the beginning, not because it is empty, but because it is not what you were trained to recognize as normal. At the same time, familiarity has a very strange power. It can make strain feel safe simply because it is known. It can make urgency feel productive simply because it is loud. It can make emotional overactivation feel meaningful simply because it is vivid. So when that vividness begins to soften, the mind may not celebrate. It may panic. It may think, where did my edge go? Where did my fire go? Why do I not feel as sharp, as intense, as compelled? But what is being questioned in that moment is not always your purpose. Sometimes it is just your relationship to a level of tension that once kept you moving. This is also why the experience can feel so personal, because it does not just seem like a change in mood. It can feel like a change in identity. You are not only noticing that your reactions are different, you are noticing that the version of you who used to run on pressure is not showing up in the same way. And if that version carried you for years, even painfully, then the silence after it can feel disorienting. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just unfamiliar enough to make you doubt yourself. But unfamiliar does not mean misaligned, and softer does not mean smaller. It simply means the old pattern is no longer speaking with the same volume. The internal command is quieter, the reflex is slower, and the emotional charge is not disappearing all at once, but it is not dominating everything either. And because you are used to reading strong activation as evidence that something matters, this quieter mode can seem almost unreal, as if life is flattening, as if meaning is draining out, when what is actually happening may be the opposite. because when a mechanism has kept you operating for a long time, its absence can feel like danger, even when it is relief. You do not miss it because it was good. You miss it because it was consistent. It gave your system a familiar rhythm, a familiar level of urgency, a familiar sense of self. So the fear is understandable. But it is still a misreading. You are not necessarily losing motivation. You may be losing your attachment to the level of internal strain that once convinced you you were alive. And that is a very different thing. So the feeling that scares you is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is the silence of a pattern that used to keep you in motion. And this is where the language matters. Because when people say they are in survival mode, they are usually not using a formal medical term. They are trying to describe an experience, a period of prolonged stress, a state of constant internal bracing, a way of moving through life with too much vigilance, too much pressure, and too little recovery to feel fully settled inside themselves. So the phrase is useful, but only when it is used carefully, not as a diagnosis, not as a fixed identity, and not as some absolute neurological truth that explains everything, because the value of that phrase is not that it sounds scientific, or in the value is that it gives people a simple way to recognize something they have been living with but never fully named. It translates a vague internal experience into language the mind can hold. It helps describe what prolonged stress can begin to feel like from the inside: the exhaustion, the constant scanning, the emotional thinning, the sense that your system is always preparing for something, even when nothing immediate is happening. And once you understand it that way, the phrase becomes less dramatic and more precise in a very human sense. This is also where a lot of content gets carried away. It takes a relatable phrase and turns it into a total explanation. It starts speaking as if every reaction, every emotion, every shift in energy can be reduced to one hidden neural command. But that is not what we are doing here. Because the deeper truth is actually quieter than that. Stress can affect how you feel, how much energy you have, and how you function in daily life. That already explains a great deal. It explains why your emotional baseline may begin to change, why your reactions may feel different, why life can start to feel heavier, flatter, or harder to regulate. There is no need to turn that into mythology just to make it sound profound. At the same time, keeping the language grounded does not make the experience less real. If anything, it makes it more trustworthy. Because now the phrase survival mode is no longer pretending to be a technical verdict. It is simply a shorthand for a period when stress has been shaping your inner world so consistently that tension begins to feel normal. And that distinction matters. When it protects you from building an identity around a phrase that was only ever meant to help you notice a pattern, this is where the reference to burnout matters too. Burnout has been described by the World Health Organization as an occupational phenomenon. That wording is important. It does not frame burnout as a dramatic personality label or a mystical state. It places it in a specific context. It acknowledges a real experience of depletion connected to work without turning that experience into something vague and all-consuming. And that helps here, because it shows the difference between careful description and exaggerated explanation. So when we use a phrase like survival mode, the safest and most useful way to hear it is this: not as a diagnosis, not as a medical category, but as everyday language for a prolonged state of strain, or vigilance, or depletion that people can recognize in themselves. A way of saying, something in me has been under pressure for too long. Something in me has been spending too much time preparing, guarding, pushing, or enduring. That language is accessible. It is relatable. And for many people, that is exactly why it works. But it only works when it stays disciplined. The moment it becomes a grand theory of the nervous system, it stops clarifying and starts distorting. The moment it is used to explain every feeling with certainty, it loses honesty. because not every difficult season is the same. Not every low energy state means the same thing. And not every period of disconnection should be turned into a dramatic narrative. Sometimes what people need most is not a bigger label, it is a cleaner one. So yes, the phrase can still be useful. It can help people feel seen. It can help them recognize prolonged stress without needing perfect language for it. It can create a bridge between lived experience and understanding, but its purpose is not to sound clinical. Its purpose is to make a hard-to-describe state easier to recognize without overstating what we actually know. And when you understand that difference, the entire conversation becomes calmer, clearer, and more responsible for the mind living through it. But this is where the experience becomes even more difficult to trust, because the first feeling of coming out of prolonged strain does not always feel like freedom. Very often, it feels like emptiness. Not a dramatic emptiness, not a total collapse, just a strange absence of the force that used to keep everything moving. The mind is quieter, but not peaceful yet. And the body is less reactive, but not fully at ease. The inner pressure is lower, but nothing inside you has learned how to interpret that softness in a reassuring way. So instead of relief, what you notice first is the gap, the space where urgency used to be, the distance between a thought and the usual rush of reaction, the missing charge behind things that once felt immediate. And because you have spent so long translating intensity into meaning, that gap can feel unnerving. It can feel like something important has gone missing, like your aliveness has dimmed, like the part of you that used to care has stepped back too far. But what you are often feeling in that moment is not the loss of self, it is the loss of constant internal acceleration. This is why people misread this phase so quickly. They expect that if something positive is happening internally, it should feel obviously positive. It should feel light, clear, open. But inner recalibration is often much subtler than that, especially after stress has been affecting how you feel, how much energy you have, and how you move through daily life. When tension has shaped your baseline for long enough, the nervous system does not immediately celebrate its absence. First, it notices the difference. And difference, before it becomes safety, often feels strange. At the same time, the human mind has a deep attachment to familiar patterns, even exhausting ones. Familiar does not always mean good. Sometimes it simply means repeated. So if your normal state has been built around pressure, anticipation, urgency, and the need to stay mentally ahead of everything, then a more stable rhythm will not instantly feel natural. It may feel slower, flatter, less charged, less emotionally convincing. Not because it is worse, but because it is not speaking in the same volume you became accustomed to trusting. And this is where the wrong conclusion often enters. People say, I do not feel as driven, so I must be losing momentum. I do not feel as intense, so I must be losing passion. I do not feel as emotionally activated, so I must be disconnecting from my life. But what is actually happening is more subtle. The system is no longer pulling you so sharply from one internal state to another. The spikes are softening. The reflex is loosening. The inner environment is beginning to lose some of its constant turbulence. And because turbulence once felt like proof that something mattered, and its absence can be mistaken for emptiness. But emptiness is not always empty. Sometimes it is just unfilled space after overactivation. Sometimes it is what remains when the body is no longer spending the same amount of energy bracing, scanning, preparing, and responding. It does not feel rewarding at first. It feels in between, not chaos, not clarity, but something transitional. You are not who you were in the old pattern, but you are not yet familiar with the steadier version of yourself either. So the feeling is easy to judge and easy to label too soon. This is also why the state can feel almost emotionally colorless in the beginning. Not because your depth is gone, but because your perception is adjusting to a different level of internal stimulation. When your system has been trained by stress for a long time, calm can feel flat before it feels nourishing. Less urgency can feel like less meaning before it feels like more room. And a quieter mind can feel unmotivated before it feels regulated. That is the paradox. The first sensation of less internal strain is not always expansion. Sometimes it is disorientation. So if this season feels blank, softer, harder to read, that does not automatically mean you are becoming less. It may simply mean you are no longer being pulled as violently by the same internal force. Not more empty, just less yanked around. And this is why phase can feel unimpressive, even when it matters. The change does not arrive like breakthrough. It arrives with less friction, less gripping, less noise. Not because life means less, but because your system is no longer shouting at you. And this is where the conversation becomes more grounded. Because there is a difference between saying something feels off inside you and recognizing that some forms of depletion have already been named more carefully in the real world. Burnout, for example, has been described by the World Health Organization as an occupational phenomenon. That wording matters. It does not turn burnout into a vague spiritual label. It does not make it a personality type. And it does not invite you to dramatize every hard season of life. It places the experience in a clearer frame, a frame connected to work, exhaustion, and prolonged strain. That matters here, because a lot of people interpret their internal changes in moral language before they interpret them in human language. They say, I am weaker now. I am less driven now. I am not the person I used to be. But if what has been happening is prolonged stress, exhaustion, and depletion, then that inner shift needs to be read differently. Not as proof that your character is collapsing, not as evidence that your ambition has disappeared, but as a sign that the way you have been carrying pressure may finally be affecting how you feel, how much energy you have, and how you function in daily life. This is why the feeling of losing your fire can be misleading. Because sometimes what you are calling passion was never pure passion to begin with. Sometimes it was pressure. Sometimes it was internal overdrive. Sometimes it was the energy of always having to brace, always having to push, always having to keep yourself moving through sheer tension. And that kind of energy can look powerful for a long time. It can look productive. It can look committed. It can even become part of how you define yourself. But when it runs for too long, it does not keep feeling like power. It begins to feel like depletion. At the same time, burnout is useful to mention precisely because it keeps this conversation from floating too far into abstraction. It reminds you that exhaustion linked to work is not just a poetic idea. It is a recognized phenomenon. And once you understand that, something important shifts in the way you read your own state. You stop asking only, why am I not as intense as I used to be? And you begin asking a different question. What if the intensity I miss was partly being fueled by strain that could not last forever? What if what I am grieving is not my purpose, but my old pattern of functioning under pressure? That is a very different realization. Because now the loss of intensity is no longer automatically a loss of meaning. It may be the consequence of prolonged depletion, a system that has spent too long giving more than it can sustainably hold, a mind that has spent too long translating stress into motion, a body that has spent too long helping you continue without asking what that continuation was costing. So when the old force starts to fade, the first story you tell yourself may be deeply unfair. You may say, I am becoming less, when a more honest reading is that something in you has been overused. This is also why the change can feel so personal. Burnout and prolonged stress do not just reduce energy in a simple way. They can alter your relationship to your own familiar intensity, the version of you that once felt sharp, fast, driven, not and relentlessly engaged, no longer shows up with the same consistency. And because that version may have carried your identity for years, its absence can feel like disconnection from yourself. But what if that disconnection is not from your real self? What if it is from the mode that kept extracting energy from you in order to keep you performing? One of the clearest signs is not that you feel more, it is that you react less. And for someone who has spent a long time living in internal urgency, that change can feel almost suspicious. Because when your old baseline was built around quick tension, fast mental scanning, and a constant readiness to respond, a softer reaction does not immediately feel healthy. It can feel delayed, flat, even wrong. And you notice that something that once would have pulled you in instantly now lands with more distance. And instead of reading that distance as space, you may read it as disconnection. This is why so many people quietly ask themselves the same question. Why does everything feel less intense now? Why am I not taking things in the same way? Why am I not overthinking every detail, replaying every possibility, preparing for every shift in the emotional atmosphere around me? And because they have not yet learned how to trust this change, they often move toward the harshest interpretation first. They assume they have become colder, less caring, less emotionally alive, less driven. But that conclusion is often too fast because it confuses reduced reactivity with reduced depth. Stress can affect emotions, reactions, and daily functioning. So when stress has shaped the way you move through life for long enough, reaction itself can start to feel like proof of sincerity. The more strongly something hits you, the more real it seems. The more urgently you respond, the more engaged you believe yourself to be. The more intensely you think about something, the more you assume it must matter. And that pattern can become so normal that when your responses begin to soften, it no longer feels like regulation. It feels like absence. At the same time, not reacting in the old way does not mean nothing is happening inside you. Sometimes it means something new is finally possible. Because when every moment is filtered through pressure, you do not really get to observe clearly. You react before you can reflect. You contract before you can choose. You move toward management before you move toward meaning. So when that internal emergency tone begins to lower, one of the first things that appears is not numbness, it is space. A pause. A little room between the trigger and the interpretation. A little room between the feeling and the identity story you used to build around it. But that space can feel deeply unfamiliar. You may notice that you no longer need to answer every internal signal immediately. You no longer feel the same rush to solve, fix, or mentally brace against every subtle shift. Certain things still matter, but they do not grip you with the same force. Certain emotions still move through you, but they do not take over the entire field of your attention. And because the drama is lower, the mind may assume the care is lower too. But what is actually happening is the opposite. Less reactivity can create more contact with what is real, not less. This is also why the change is so easy to misname. Reacting less can look like apathy from the outside, and sometimes even from the inside. But apathy is not the only explanation for quiet. Sometimes quiet is what remains when the system is no longer pulling every experience into survival language. Sometimes quiet is what happens when you stop treating every emotional movement like an emergency. Sometimes quiet is the first honest sign that your inner world is not being constantly interrupted by the same old pattern of alarm. So if you are wondering why things do not hit you the way they used to, do not rush to call that emptiness. Do not rush to call it distance from life. Do not rush to call it loss of heart. The reduced reaction may not mean you are less connected. It may mean you are less hijacked, less thrown, less ruled by reflex. And that difference matters more than most people realize, because reacting less is not always caring less. Sometimes it is the first time you have enough space to actually see clearly. And this is where the deeper paradox begins to reveal itself. Because many people assume change becomes real only when it appears outside them, in their circumstances, in their relationships, in the visible shape of daily life. They look for external confirmation first, a different reality, a clearer result, a life that visibly reflects what they feel has been shifting inside. So when their inner state begins to change, but the outer structure still looks familiar, they conclude that nothing meaningful has happened yet. But that conclusion is often too early, because the first movements are not always external. Sometimes they are perceptual. Sometimes they happen in the space between stimulus and response, in the amount of urgency you feel when something goes wrong, in the way your thoughts no longer grip every possibility with the same force, in the way certain things still matter but do not consume your whole internal field the way they once did. These are quiet changes, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss, especially if you were taught to trust only what can be seen immediately. This is why the mind keeps returning to the same question. If something has changed, why does my life still look the same? Why do the same rooms, the same routines, the same responsibilities, the same unresolved pieces still seem to be there? Why does the outer world not instantly reflect the shift I can almost sense, but cannot fully prove? And the answer is not necessarily that nothing is happening. It may be that the external world is simply slower than the internal one, slower to catch up, slower to mirror what has already begun rearranging inside your perception. At the same time, most people have been conditioned to measure progress through visible evidence, through outcomes, through behavior, through recognizable milestones. But internal change rarely performs that way in the beginning. It does not always announce itself with action. Sometimes it appears first as less panic, less over-identification, less emotional acceleration, less reflexive urgency. And because stress can affect how you feel and how you function in daily life, the reduction of that stress-shaped pattern may show up internally before anything outside has had time to reorganize around it. That is why the change can be real before it is obvious. This is also why the phase feels so strange. You are no longer entirely inside the old state, but you are not yet standing in a visibly new reality either. So the mind interprets the gap as failure. It says, if this were real, everything would look different by now. If this mattered, I would have proof. If I were truly changing, my life would already reflect it clearly. But what if that expectation is built on a misunderstanding of how change unfolds? What if the shift begins not in the scenery of your life, but in the way you meet that scenery, in the way you process it, in the way you stop feeding the same loops with the same emotional intensity? Then the absence of immediate external change is not necessarily a contradiction. It may simply be a delay, a lag between internal recalibration and outer expression. The thoughts are different before the circumstances are. The reactions soften before the environment does. The sense of urgency lowers before the visible structure rearranges itself. And because that sequence is less dramatic than people expect, they often miss its significance. They assume that nothing has moved because nothing has transformed fast enough to satisfy the old demand for proof. But inner change does not become valid only when it becomes visible. It is still change when it is subtle. It is still movement when it is quiet. It is still real when it lives first in perception, pacing, and response. That is the part people overlook. And they wait for life to look different before trusting that they are different. They wait for external evidence before honoring internal transition. And in doing so, they misread the most important early signs. So if things feel different inside you, even while the outside still looks familiar, do not rush to call that stagnation. Do not assume the absence of visible proof means the absence of real movement. Sometimes the world around you is not refusing to change. It is simply moving more slowly than the shift that has already begun within you. You're not always waiting for your life to become different. Sometimes your life is still catching up to the quieter change that has already happened inside. And this is the final piece that many people resist the longest. Once you have lived inside pressure for enough time, calm does not automatically feel trustworthy. In fact, one of the strongest temptations in this phase is to recreate the old intensity on purpose, to push yourself back into urgency, to provoke the familiar inner rush, to return to the pressure that once made you feel sharp, necessary, and alive. Not because it was actually sustaining you, but because it was recognizable. And when something familiar disappears, the mind often tries to restore it before it learns how to live without it. This is why people so easily romanticize the version of themselves that ran on tension. They remember the speed, the force, the drive, the constant movement. They remember how intensely they felt everything, how quickly they responded, how much energy seemed to move through them when pressure was high. Oh, but they do not always remember the cost with the same clarity, the exhaustion, the internal strain, the way prolonged stress can affect emotions, energy, and daily functioning, the way depletion can slowly become normal, the way burnout as an occupational phenomenon reminds us that prolonged exhaustion is not something to glorify just because it once looked productive from the outside. At the same time, the quieter state now can feel almost underwhelming by comparison, less dramatic, less charged, less heroic. And because the old pattern was so intense, the new one can seem small even when it is healthier. That is the illusion. We assume that what feels bigger must be more alive, that what feels louder must be more true, that what feels calmer must be weaker. But intensity is not always life. And sometimes it is just familiarity wearing the mask of purpose. This is where a different kind of trust has to begin. Not trust in pressure, not trust in force, but trust in a steadier internal state that does not need to keep proving itself through constant reaction. A state that is less dramatic, but more coherent, less urgent, but more honest, less driven by alarm, but more capable of clear response. And that shift matters because when your inner world is not being pulled in 10 directions by the same old strain, you begin to choose from a different place. Not from reflex, not from fear, not from the need to feel intense in order to feel real, but from something quieter and more stable. That is why this phase should not be mistaken for loss. It may be the first time your system is no longer asking you to survive through pressure alone. It may be the first time you are not confusing activation with alignment. It may be the first time your sense of self is no longer dependent on how tightly you can hold yourself together under strain. And yes, that can feel unfamiliar. But unfamiliar is not the same as wrong. Sometimes it is simply what honesty feels like before it becomes home. So the answer is not to force yourself back into tension just to feel vivid again. It is to let a steadier state become believable, to stop worshiping the version of you that only knew how to function through pressure, to recognize that some things do not fade because they are dying. Some things soften because they no longer need to scream. Not everything that quiets is a loss. Some things grow quiet so you can hear yourself clearly for the first time. So if things have felt quieter lately, do not rush to call that the loss of your passion. What you have heard throughout this video is simpler and deeper than that. Prolonged stress can distort the way you read yourself. A state of constant internal pressure can start to feel normal. Language like survival mode may help describe that experience, but it is still only language. And when the intensity begins to soften, that does not automatically mean you are becoming less. Sometimes it means your system is no longer forcing everything through reaction. That is why this shift can feel so easy to misunderstand. You are not reacting the same way. Your mind is not gripping the same way. The old urgency is not controlling every moment with the same force. And because the drama is lower, you may assume the meaning is lower too. But what is actually happening may be the opposite. Less violence inside does not always mean less life. Sometimes it means more stability, more space, more truth. So if this is where you are, let yourself name it differently. Not as failure, not as emptiness, not as proof that you have lost yourself, but as a quieter recalibration, a life that is no longer being lived only through reflex. Not everything that softens is disappearing. Some things soften so you can finally hear them clearly. You do not need to force the old fire back just to prove you still care. The calmer state may be less dramatic, but it may also be the first state that lets your life become clear without strain. If you recognize yourself in this, comment, "I'm not losing myself, I'm recalibrating." And if you want quantum secrets to keep unpacking the inner states most people misname, stay here with this channel. Because sometimes, the biggest change in you does not arrive like an explosion. It arrives like silence.